The IIS 7.5 FTP server includes some great new features, including enhanced capabilities for authentication, logging, authorization, and user home directories. First, we'll install the FTP server features on IIS7, which is a server core computer. After doing this, we need to configure the FTP SVC service to automatically start. Installing the FTP service causes it to start, but we'll use the scconfig command to set the FTP SVC service to start automatically. Although the new FTP service includes the same XML-based configuration file type that the IIS web service uses, we'll use a full Windows Server 2008 R2 installation to remotely administer the FTP service on the remote computer. Here we can see the IIS Manager FTP service integration in the GUI. Next, we'll add a new FTP site to IIS7. This will be an FTP site used to store virtual machines, or VMs, used in product testing. Within the IIS 7.5 FTP service, we can use virtual host names to distinguish multiple FTP sites on the same server. Although the built-in command line FTP client does not yet support FTP site host names, we'll see later in this demonstration that we can modify the username to send virtual host information to the server, thereby accomplishing the same thing. If this server were configured with multiple IP addresses, we could bind the FTP site we're creating to a single IP address, but in this case we'll specify a virtual host name instead. The IIS 7.5 FTP service supports SSL for both data and control channel encryption. The only requirement is a valid server certificate and a client that supports FTP over Secure Sockets Layer, or SSL. In this case, we will allow clients to use SSL, but we will not require them to. For now, let's configure this FTP site to allow anonymous users to read files, but not to write files to the server. In this scenario, we want anyone with access to this FTP server to be able to download VMs, but we would also like to allow administrators to upload new VMs to the site. To do this, we'll add an authentication rule to our newly created FTP site. First, we need to enable basic authentication. In cases where passwords need to be secured in combination with basic authentication, be sure that you require SSL. Note that IIS 7.5 also supports custom authentication providers for the FTP service. This extensibility makes it easy to customize the FTP service for a greater variety of use scenarios. Now that we've enabled basic authentication for the site, we can add our authorization rule to permit administrators to upload VMs. We'll add an allow authorization rule that permits members of the VM admins group to both read and write files to this FTP site. When a user provides credentials to access the site, the FTP service will check their group membership. Now that we've configured the level of access we want to provide for this FTP site, we need to configure a DNS record to facilitate name resolution for the test VMs site. IIS7 already has an address record in the corp.contoso.com zone, and we could add an alias record type. The alias record type resolves to the host record that the alias record points to. Instead of using an alias record, let's add a new host record, which provides greater naming consistency for the test VM's FTP site because the host record type resolves directly to the IP address. Next, we'll test access to the test VM's FTP site. We'll use the built-in command line FTP client to connect to the test VM's FTP site. When we provide the username, we must also specify the virtual host name in front of the username, separated by a pipe symbol. Other FTP clients will often automatically pass the virtual host name to the FTP server. You can see that when you're logged on as an anonymous user, you can download or read files from the FTP site. We can also see that an attempt to upload or write a file to the FTP site fails because anonymous users have not been granted the write permission to the FTP site. Before we make any more changes to the FTP site configuration, let's take a look at how the configuration information for the test VM site is stored. The application host.config file, which also stores website configuration settings, is the location where FTP site configuration is stored. The Sites section of the application host.config file is where you find the FTP site configuration settings. We can see here that both the default website and the test VM's FTP site store configuration data in the application host.config file. Now let's look at some of the request filtering capabilities of the IIS7.5 FTP service. In this scenario, we'll configure the test VM site to allow only virtual hard disk, or VHD, and virtual machine configuration, or VMC, files to be transferred to or from the server. The Request Filter Features Settings page is where we configure these settings. First, let's change the default policy of allowing file extensions which have not been explicitly allowed. This is a more restrictive policy, but it makes it easier to configure the type of access we want. Next, let's add the VHD file extension as an allowed file extension. And let's also add the VMC file extension. Because no other file extensions are listed, we will be able to read and write only VHD and VMC files to this FTP site. You can enable other types of request filtering by clicking on the relevant tab, as you see here. The IIS7.5 FTP service has also made improvements to FTP logging. Here we will configure the FTP service to log information about bytes sent and bytes received. In this scenario, we could use this information to determine how much bandwidth is being consumed by uploading and downloading VMs for testing.